we'll refer back to some of that as well as we start thinking through some of the different pieces and talk about that a little bit. So I guess to get started, the income in the current non-current inventory and income becomes a little bit tricky, I think, for a lot of teachers as we look at those. And one of the biggest things as we get started that I would share, and I think that for those that have maybe helped with the application process and the scoring process at the national level, I can tell you that this is the one area that regardless of how well done the rest of your application is, this is one area that will absolutely prevent you from becoming a national finalist. So if you want to, I mean, if you're going to focus on an area and really scour over an area and you're going to spend a lot of time on one, this is one of those areas to do that. And the reason for that is that if there are major financial errors in the application, it's not something that we necessarily want it to go forward. Even if it's a really well-written and well-completed application, those financial concerns are pretty large. And so that's something that's kind of rolled out and been pretty consistent since during the time that I was on the committee. So just definitely keep that in mind. But as you look at that application and the PowerPoint, and I'll try and share everything here on my desktop just because I'm going to flip between a couple of different things. As we look at the PowerPoint that was created and been shared earlier, one of the big things that we want to look at is that income and expense statement and looking at the scoring part of it. I think if we look at that, where we really get into it and some of the things that I want you to keep in mind are the ideas of current and non-current. What do those really mean? And where do we need to make sure that we've got the right things in the right places? We need to make sure that all revenue and expenses are included. And the reason for that, and there needs to be an explanation for that, excuse me. And the reason for that is that as someone is sitting and scoring that application, there is no record book for us to go back and look at. There's no one that we can ask questions to. So at some point in that application, there needs to be a very defined way of explaining why there were major expenses or why there were major income pieces to the project. So for example, if you sold, or if your students sold 6 animals in a year when normally they were selling 2, that's a pretty significant difference. And there's going to be a spike in income that year. You need to make sure that that's documented in either one of the questions in question 1 or question 2 at the beginning of the application, or that needs to be documented on that personal page at the end of the application, so that it's very, very clear that we can see that there was a difference and we can understand where that change is. Remember that there's no one, like I said, there's no one we can ask questions to, so that becomes really important that there's somewhere in the application that documents and explains why there's changes in those financial records. And so as you think about that, be very, very diligent to that point. So if we look at the actual application, one of the things that I'll tell you is, and one of the things that gets people caught up, is this idea of the value of production transferred to the enterprise or transferred to non-current bartered or labor exchange. This line has got to equal other parts of the application. So one thing that you can do in the equation that we use is 1F equals 2D plus 2E plus 4B plus 4C. So if you look at the application and you look under section 2, 2D and 2E, whatever that number is there, added with the numbers that are then going to be added here in 4, so 4B and 4C, they should all add together, and that should all equal whatever that number is in line F. 1F, excuse me. If it doesn't, I can tell you that's a financial concern, and that's an issue that we have. So you need to make sure that that's well laid out. And there's lots of students that are going to be able to, that are going to have some labor exchanged. So for example, if mom and dad own the barn and they pay for the barn and they pay for feed in exchange for them helping with the other animals on the farm, there's a barter that's taken place. That needs to be documented. Okay, that needs to be there. There needs to be some sort of exchange of money for any type of work that's being done, or for use of a facility or use of something that's not theirs. So that's really important for you to keep in mind. And that's probably one of the biggest things that I've seen as I worked through this process, is to see that that line does not always equal what it should. Okay, and that does become a concern. The other piece is then when we look here at the expenses sometimes are going to vary. So in this case, we see we go from 680 to 23,523. Well, somewhere in the application, there should be an explanation of why we've gone from this inventory and only spending $680, and now we magically have 23,523. So where did that come from? Where did we start to see that change, and where did we see, or why did that change occur? So in this case, it's on cash sales. We see that cash sales is there. We know that there's going to be some sales, so they have some money. So they're going to be able to purchase some things. So now we know that there's going to be inventory that's going to be purchased. The question that I would have here is, where did that come to? How did we get to that 23,523 based on only spending 1,254? Okay. Now, I'm not saying that we have to be able to answer that question right now on this application, but it's definitely something that we want to consider and think about, because that's the types of questions that we're going to ask as we sit there and they review those individual applications. And so we need to be able to see and justify why that's laid out the way that it is. Questions so far on the income and expense sheet before we go any further? Excellent. Okay. So if we look at that and then we get into this idea of non-current and current inventory, in non-current, we're then going to see the same types of things. So we've got purchases, you've got a beginning inventory, and all of that's going to line out the same way. Again, we need to see that there's actual justification to a lot of that. Okay. So as you look at this part of the application, that all is then going to come from later on in the application. So that's going to then come from that next page. Oops, excuse me, as we hit the wrong button. So as we look here, we're then going to get all of these values from those next two pages where they're going to be split out. So can somebody tell me what is the difference between current and non-current? I can try and call on somebody too. I don't really want to, but.
Melissa Webb says current is used in a year.
Okay, yep, that's a perfect way to do that, is current is used in a year. And so that's one way to think about it. What would non-current then be?
Chelsea Begno, current is used over a short period of time. Non-current is reused and depreciates.
Perfect. So that's the key part, is the depreciation. Okay, if it doesn't depreciate, then we see issues as well. So the people that are scoring are told to have some sort of deduction that they're going to include if a depreciation is not included on that non-current. Okay, so current inventory is then going to be listed on that first page. So current inventory is going to be anything like feed. And I'm going to tell you, at the end of the year, when you end a proficiency application, I have never met a student that has an animal or has some project going on but doesn't have some form of current inventory. Unless it's magically that they've sold the business and they're no longer doing it, there's something that they still have left over. So if it's a row crop project or a production project, or it's animals, there's going to be feed or seed or something that's going to still be there that they're going to use that following year. You need to make sure that you account for that. I can tell you that some people may not count much off. Other people may count a lot off for that because they feel like that's not necessarily something that's just not realistic. Okay, so each of those things are going to change. There's not a magic thing that I can tell you about what types of points are deducted for each piece, because each person has to score consistently based on the rubric. So for one person, it may be a deduction of 3 points. For another person, based on the rubric, it may be a deduction of 6 points. I don't know, and I can't promise you that there's one way or another of what that looks like. You just have to know that there's going to be that variance in there, and you need to make sure that that's considered. The other thing is that if you have animals that you're showing, so for example, if you had an animal that you were going to use in February for one of the livestock shows or for the state show, you're going to have had that animal at the end of the year. That animal needs to be listed on here as well so that it can continue on into the following show season and finishing up in that show season. So you've got to make sure, again, that all of those animals are listed there and that they're going to be included. The other one then is raised market animals. And I see that this one kind of gets a little bit more of a concern for some people. So the way that that's always been described and the way that we've kind of thought through that is if it's a raised market animal, it's an animal that we're going to sell, but we're going to sell to someone else to raise out. Okay? Or it's a new animal that just came into our herd that's not going to be used for breeding. We're going to then sell that animal for slaughter. If we're not, then it's going to be a breeding animal, then it's going to move into that non-current component. And then that's listed on the next page. So as you look at this, think of anything that is there and include any of those things, because I promise you it's going to make a difference when it comes to the way that that looks and the way that that's included. On the next page, and I see that that's not included in here, so give me 1 second here. Let me pull up one of the things. And Brandon, have they seen where there's sample applications on the National FFA website? Oops.
Yes, they have. I pulled those up, and I can pull one up real quick if you'd like.
Okay, so if we come in here and we just look at one of these, actually, I don't know if that's going to have, let's do poultry production because that should have a, okay, so we have first that piece that's going to be on the current inventory. Then we're going to have non-depreciable animals that are breeding animals. We're also going to have depreciable breeding animals. We're going to have depreciable market or machinery, equipment, fixtures, and then depreciable land improvements, buildings, and fences. So as you lay those out, you're going to be able to see what each of those pieces are, and then you're going to be able to include them. Now, one of the things that we are going to see is, and that they're going to want to see is, if it is in this depreciable piece, they're going to want to see some sort of depreciation claimed, and it needs to be realistic. So you can get online and you can find a lot of different depreciation calculators that can help you through that process. It should be, I mean, the way that I used to do it and the way that one of the specialists that came in and kind of talked with everybody that was scoring a couple of years ago explained it is, if you go online and you go to Facebook Marketplace or you go to Craigslist or something like that and you look for an item that you're trying to find that's similar and you see what that price is, that's a good idea of depreciation based on time and based on use and based on condition. So think about what that looks like, and then you can claim what that depreciation is over that time and what that looked like. The one that's hard is then when we get into animals and we talk about breeding animals. A lot of times, what do we know about breeding animals? Do they appreciate or do they kind of stay consistent? Thoughts? I mean, let's pick on someone. So the first person I see here is Catherine Bell. What do you think? Do they appreciate? Do they depreciate? Do they stay consistent?
I'm gonna be honest. I filled out many a livestock proficiency, and I can remember, and I always have to ask someone.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take a stab at it though.
Okay.
I want to say that if they're breeding animals, they depreciate.
Okay.
If they're like your non-breeding doesn't depreciate. It's like one depreciates and one does not.
Okay. Perfect. So would anybody like to add to that?
Dr. Rubenstein, does it have to do with their breeding age if they are of age and of maturity?
Ah, that has part to do with it. Part to do with it. What else? What else might influence this as well? Mr. Watkins, what do you think?
Not sure.
Not sure. Okay. So how about if you take an animal and you show that animal, it does really well somewhere, does the value of that animal go up or go down? It appreciates. I think I saw Mrs. Watkins mouth that. So yeah, it does. They appreciate. And so they can appreciate if there is some piece to it and there's some consideration. Now, here's the reason I say that. That explanation then needs to be in that application as well. So what is causing for the appreciation of that animal? Because in some cases they do. Think about horses, for example. A horse that wins the Triple Crown is going to appreciate significantly in value compared to an animal that is just running around a basic track and they never win. That animal is probably going to depreciate. Okay, so based on the performance of that animal, there's a chance for it to appreciate, but there has to be explanation about it. If there's no explanation, again, that's where it comes into question. And then we have to worry about, well, where is that? Are they kind of making that number up? Where does that number come from? So we need to make sure that we explain that, again, in questions 1 or 2 at the beginning of the application, or on that personal page at the end. Okay, and so we need to be able to see that. Now, the one thing I'll say is that not all animals are going to appreciate. So just because their breeding age gets better, just because they get to a point where they're going to be able to produce an offspring, it does not mean that they appreciate. There has to be a significant reason as to why they would appreciate. So they've won something, they've performed really well somewhere, whatever. That's going to change. The value that we use is also going to be different. There's a market value that we can use based on current market prices. But there's also a value based on lineage. So for example, if an animal is, from a really high quality stock, they're probably going to be worth, and they will be worth a little bit more because they carry that genetic material. And they're going to be able to provide that genetic material and those changes to their offspring as well. So we want to balance that. Again, that if it's a higher value than what we might expect, we need to be able to justify that in the application and write that out. And I think, to be honest, that is one of the biggest areas. And I know that Mr. Benson and I know that Mr. Ray both have had an opportunity to score on the national level. And I mean, please let me know if you think that if I've said something that you don't agree with. But based on my experience, that is probably one of the biggest areas that we see some changes, or at least it brings in some questions when it comes to scoring the application. Mr. Benson?
You're exactly right. Livestock value can change depending on their performance, their offspring, whatnot, and they'll go up in value quite a bit. Average livestock, once they get into the production stage, though, they're going to depreciate.
Correct. Yep. And that's where you kind of see that change, and you've got these two areas. So if it goes into that, if they're on that depreciation level, then we need to move them down to the depreciation, draft, pleasure, and breeding animals on that next line, or in that next section. And honestly, I think that in most of the applications that I've seen, there is something that's going to be included in this area simply because they've got animals that are on all spectrums, or all places on the spectrum. They've got animals that they've raised that, I mean, did okay, but they're not blowing it out of the water. And then if you've got somebody that's really kind of got a high-end project, and somebody that spent a lot of time or a lot of money on their project, then they're probably going to see something that's on that higher end as well. You're going to start to see some of that appreciation. And so you just want to make sure that you balance that, and again, provide that explanation, most definitely on the appreciation side of that scale, to make sure that that's clear.
Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but livestock raised, calves or lambs or whatnot, are on the current inventory list until they get to the stage that they start to produce.
That is correct.
And then you transfer them into the non-current inventory page.
That is absolutely correct. Once they get to breeding age, then they flip sides. So until that point, because there's the opportunity that they could be sold, they stay on the current side up until that point. That's exactly correct. The other one that I see this, honestly, I see this happen more often, is this idea of the machinery and equipment. Sometimes I think we forget to include some things in there that we're going to use over and over and over and over again. So these are things like clippers, any type of like stanchions, or if there's going to be some sort of, for example, like a trailer or something along those lines, those should be included here. We should see some depreciation on that. We know that their value goes down. Now, that depreciation may not be quite as significant as other things based on the lifespan of that item, but we do know that there's going to be some depreciation. So if you're saying that you are showing XYZ animal, but you're not including some of those show items, again, there's going to be questions. So as you look at those applications and you start looking at the expense and income statements, really take time to think about what are the necessary things that we include and that we use and we should use in that project or in that program. We need to make sure that that's documented then somewhere in the application. So for example, if there needs to be someone that clips, or you're going to clip an animal, if there's not a clipper on here, again, somewhere you're going to want to show and you're going to want to explain that you have someone come in and maybe fit the animal, or that you actually use a school set of supplies. And so a lot of the show supplies are coming from the school's resources. That's something that we need to explain again so that we can see where that justification is. The more explanation that there is in the beginning portion of the application, the easier it is for us to justify that and for us to be able to score that application later on. Okay?
Got to remember, the kids aren't around to ask clarifying questions at that point. And so someone sitting at the table has to make a judgment call. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not, you know, it can be hurtful to the score because there's just not enough information. Yeah. But what Eric says is absolutely correct. And we see this a lot, that at the end, the last date, December 31st of 2019, and their inventory shows that they've got, 20 head of cattle, but their non-current doesn't show that they have any feed. Yeah. It's crazy, because what are you going to feed them on January 1st? You've got to have current inventory in there that you're going to feed that stock that next day that you own according to your application.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not that I think, and I agree with you, Mr. Benson. I don't know that I'll actually say I don't think that it very often is in favor of the student when there's questions. It's always erred on the side of caution that it may not actually be documented correctly. And I don't think that that's to penalize a student, but as you're sitting there and reading the applications, and as you're trying to go through and score them, it's really hard to work in favor sometimes, because if we don't have proof of it, when somebody else does have proof, it's hard for us to give points thinking that it probably is true, rather than when we know that it's true in another application.
Yeah, and just remember, this is a competition. Mm-hmm. Your applications are lined up next to somebody else, and if somebody else is more complete and more specific, who's going to receive the greater amount of points?
Yep. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. So any other questions? And I know I can't see a chat box, so if you do, Mr. Ray or Mr. Benson, if you will, please read them to me. But are there questions, or you can unmute?
Yeah, Chelsea Begno was asking, should we include items like trailers or other expensive equipment that may not have been purchased by the student?
Yes, and the reason for that is that's a trade or a barter that's then coming into the project. Now, if it's something that you're bartering just for the use of it, then no, you don't include it. But if you get it as a gift, so say mom and dad went out and bought them for Christmas, they bought them a livestock trailer, then yes, it does need to be included in here. If it's a barter, and that's, again, all of that has to be documented at the beginning. If it's a barter, so I work for mom and dad to use their livestock trailer, then no, it is not included in here because it's not inventory to my program or my project or my program. It's actually something that I'm bartering the use of, and that's a little different. So gift, yes. Bartered, no.
But the deal is, if you include it in there, if you include it as part of your non-current property, but you look back in the financial statements and you can't figure out how this kid is paid for it, it hurts you.
It does.
So you've got to show it either in the bartering, or just make the statement in prompt number 1 and question number 1 and let them know that, certain equipment, is provided by either the school or your family to help you have a successful project, and you can list those things. And then it becomes understandable that, the kid doesn't have to pay for a stock trailer that he's hauling his animals around with because mom and dad have one.
Yep.
And you don't have to barter for that. You're just borrowing it from your parents. That's nobody's going to discredit you on that.
Absolutely. I think as long as, and the only caveat I'd give to that, Mr. Benson, is if you state that, then you need to say that it is with no barter. I mean, that's just provided to you, especially if it's from the school or especially from your parents. A lot of times they expect that because it's from their parents, they're probably working and doing other things on the farm or in that same area that's then going to offset the use of some sort of equipment. So I know quite a few judges that would maybe count a couple points off if you don't state that, but it's easy. And if you stated in there that there isn't a barter to it, then there's nowhere for it to go in the application. And that's a clear piece that they cannot take points off of that student. So just the more clarity that you can provide in those questions, the easier it is for us to be able to justify something later on. And it answers questions. I mean, the number one thing when someone comes up with a question to the application, and I know, I think I said this to Mr. Benson even a time or two from the table that he was working at, is that have you looked through the application to see if it's justified anywhere? Because a lot of times we can find a justification for something if we look for it. In those times when there is no justification, we have to say that it really wasn't included in the application. You need to score that accordingly. That's, not code or anything, but typically if that's what's said, then it's going to be points that are deducted because we can't justify where something went or where something should be.
Yeah. And I think, for a lot of kids and maybe teachers that think that they're building a stronger application by including, the values of a barn, that is worth $30,000 or more, or a trailer that's worth $15,000. And so you're building up this inventory and it has this big value in it. You think that it's making your application stronger, but it could be hurting your application.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially if the big dollar items are where people get killed all the time, because it throws numbers off somewhere in the application. And that's where people they just lose a lot of points. A lot of points. The other hard part is, and I'm not trying to advocate for AET, so let me just state that right now for those of you that don't use AET in your classroom. But the downside to not having AET is that there's sometimes that some of the calculations can get off because you're hand inputting some numbers. And because of that, it can sometimes skew some of the actual calculations. So if you are entering numbers on your own, make sure you're calculating everything and everything matches and it runs correctly. Because I've watched too many people that then they call, that I'll talk to, or they'll come and say something to me afterwards and be like, well, I did everything. It should have all calculated. It all worked. I entered the numbers correctly into the application. Sometimes, it's an electronic document. Everything's not perfect all the time. So make sure you double check. I will say if it comes from AET, I've seen a lot less problems. And I would almost venture to say that I've not really seen many problems if it's calculating things and pulling it directly from the application or from the records that are in the AET system and putting it into the application. It does seem to work a little smoother. Doesn't mean that it's perfect, but definitely double and triple check those numbers. Because again, it doesn't matter how great that application is. If there are financial errors on there, it immediately keeps it from being in those top 4. So, I mean, and that's just part of the competition.
Sorry. The other areas are pretty subjective in scoring, but numbers are numbers and they need to add up correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So questions on the budget stuff before we flip gears and move into efficiency factors.
All right, here's one from Miss Morales. The majority of our students are sponsored a heifer during the show season, and in March, they are returned to the farmer. How should these be listed?
That again goes under that barter trade and transfer. So you're bartering on that in essence, okay? So it's a gift to you that you're going to use, and then you're going to bring that animal back. So one of the best things that you can do is the cover page of that app or that contract that you signed with the farmer. That's a great thing to have at the end of your personal page, so that we can see that it's a leased animal that you're going to be using.
Yes, if it's leased, it becomes an entrepreneurship.
Yes,
but it could easily be a placement project.
it could be if it's not leased. That's correct. If there's a contract that you're leasing the animal, it's entrepreneurship.
So it really depends on how you do your wordsmithing on that one in your agreement.
If you're saying you're working for them to show the animal, and it always stays their property, it stays at their farm, they're in control of the animal, the only thing you're doing and the student is showing it, then the wording on that does become very important. You're correct, Mr. Miller.
The difficult thing with those called leased dairy heifers in a lot of cases is that you take it on, and from my understanding, because I've never done this project with any students, but in many cases I understand that the students are paying for the feed, okay? And in the end, many of the students are just handing back those heifers, okay? So they've got this expense involved. In terms of an entrepreneurship, they're going in the hole. That, you remember, teaching an entrepreneurship is teaching business skills and making business decisions. That's not a good business, okay? Again, also in a placement project, it doesn't make a lot of good business sense to say you're working for somebody, but you're paying for all the expenses of the business either. So that really is a tough one. And it may be a great SAE in terms of learning responsibility and record keeping and whatnot, but it may not make the strongest application in terms of competitive nature. So hopefully with those dairy heifers, when you put in feed, that you have an agreement with the dairymen that you're either paid by weight gained or they provide the feed. And in those circumstances, then that would dictate maybe how you would enter this as a project.